Thank you, everyone, for attending today. Thank you for giving your time this morning to talk about this and to listen to our experience and recommendations. Um, it's a real privilege to speak to you. I'm from Northern California, even though I live in Southern California. Don't hold that against me. I'm from the Sacramento River Delta. I grew up in Ileton and came to college down here in Southern California and met my wife and did what Northern Californians say they'll never do. I live in Southern California. So anyway, um, I am not an expert on Tahoe at all, but I'm an expert on missing middle housing and reform-based codes and zoning codes and zoning standards and objective standards. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So the focus on today is missing middle housing. So why is it important? For the majority of the 20th century, communities saw the centers of their communities what we now call walkable places. You've heard that term probably in some way. What we now call walkable places were actually becoming vacant in the 20th century. People were leaving them. They were going away from them and building out in the suburbs, building farther and farther away from the centers of cities. In the latter half of the 20th century, that started to reverse. And the 21st century, that's what it's all about. People are realizing they can't, either for the conserving agriculture or nature, or because they can't afford to extend out into nowhere any longer. People are coming back to the cities and back to walkable places of all kinds of sizes. And there's a lot of research on this, and several groups are corroborating this. You can see a couple statistics here that basically people, not everyone, of course, but um, a majority of people are increasingly seeing the value in walkable places. And walkable places, um, we'll talk about that quite a lot today, but they come in all different shapes and sizes. But unfortunately, uh, most of the attention, the early attention on walkable places was at this scale. So if you talk to people in cities, they say, yeah, this is what a walkable place is like. It is, but it's not the only version. And here's a local version in South Lake Tahoe. Um, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And this is the kind of walkable place that I'm talking about today. When we talk about missing middle housing and neighborhood scaled walkable places, this is the kind of place we're talking about. It certainly can include this, but this is at one end of the spectrum and the other end of the spectrum is here. And so that's what, when you hear me to talk about walkable places today, this is what I'm referring to. Along with that, there's an increasing trend across the country that we're seeing that, these are the three choices essentially that people are given in terms of housing choices: either the detached single family house, which they may or may not be able to afford or want, and then the townhouse, which is an attached single family house in most cases, or the apartment flat. And sometimes they're big 6-story buildings like this, or they're 2 or 3-story buildings, but they're bigger apartment projects. And so some people don't want to live in them, and some people don't want those buildings as neighbors. And so these three choices are prevalent across the country in terms of what people are offered. But increasingly, we're finding that the choices out there that people want are a little more subtle. So baby boomers, and I'm one of them, I'm right in that 55 to 64 band of age. Increasingly, baby boomers are starting to say, hey, we've got a house and the kids are out of the house, we're empty nesters. Um, let's reconsider where we're living. Maybe we have too big of a house, we need something smaller. And so that's certainly happening. The other end of the spectrum is our kids. My daughter's 23. She's right at this band of millennials, but she's thinking like this. There are 2/3 of them that are saying, I don't want that house that I grew up in. I don't want to maintain the yard. I don't want to, live too far away from the action. I want to be closer to things. So that's happening. And the other big demographic trend that we're seeing across the country is that A third of households are actually single-person households. It's quite a change from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. So uh, the big question here is if you're planning your housing with this in mind, and most communities that we talk to are not, they're still thinking about households that are larger. And certainly there are a lot of households that are larger, but the point here is that about a third of them, um, according to the US Census Bureau, are actually single person households. So what's missing middle housing? It's really important to think of this as a band in a spectrum here. You can see the diagram that Karen was showing at the beginning of this meeting. This is a diagram that Dan Perolick in our office created, oh, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago now, through the observation that there are houses, and then there are at the other end of the spectrum, the mid-rise or the larger apartment buildings or the Main Street buildings. And then in between, uh, up until the 40s, about the 40s, there used to be all these other things that were just being built in neighborhoods, duplexes, fourplexes, courtyards, all these other things. And for a variety of reasons, the zoning outlawed them or made it very difficult to make these happen. So we'll talk about that. But basically, missing middle housing, the way to say it to somebody, we figured out the most concise way to say it to another person if they have 8 seconds to tell you and to listen. It's house scale buildings with multiple units in walkable neighborhoods. So that walkable place is part of it. So let's break that down. I want to walk through examples of missing middle housing out in real places. And on the top of the slide, you're going to see the name of the missing middle type, in this case, duplex side by side. And on the right-hand top, you're going to see the range of density of units per acre. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with density, density is a numerical standard that that has been in many cities' zoning codes and general plans, and is a way of controlling how much gets built on each lot. But the sad fact is that it was really a technique to understand how much could be built over big areas of land, over 50, 60 years ago when they first started really using this technique across the country. It was a way to forecast what was needed, how many people would be in a certain place, and to try and prevent overcrowding, which was something that was happening in the early 20s in New York and places like that. So this tool that was originally meant to try and help forecast has now found itself in all the zoning codes of at least cities in California and general plans, and has become this metric. And so people have, as you might be aware, they have pretty intense conversations about that number. So that's why I'm taking a while to explain it here. It's certainly important, but as you're going to see, it's not the most important thing to be talking about. And at the bottom right of each of these slides, you'll see the size of the lot that is on the slide, and then some other sizes that could also work for that building type. So this duplex side by side, that's the first one I'm going to show you of 9 types. And the important thing to note here is that I think duplex for a lot of communities has come to mean 2 big single family houses glued together with a lot line in between. And that's not what the duplex side by side was originally meant to be. All of these buildings that I'm going to show you are what we call house scale. So if you think of the biggest house in town as the biggest one of these could be, then that's it. But it never was more than one house put together with another. So this one is intended to be in the size of one house with 2 units side by side. Then the cousin of that is the duplex stacked. So instead of side by side, this is a duplex with 1 unit on top and 1 unit on the bottom. You can see here that this is a street full of them in a beautiful neighborhood in Los Angeles. You can see the stair on the right-hand side in the middle of the screen going to the top unit, and each of the units is a flat. And then it's important to note here, with the side-by-side, the building footprint is a little wider. You can see that, like from one end of the building to the other across that porch. And look at this one, it's a little narrower. So all these considerations are things that you need to take into account when you're writing standards for all these different types. So that's the duplex stack. And then there's the cottage court, where it's small individual units arranged around a garden or a court like this, with maybe one building in the back that has 2 or 3 units. And this is a really, a lot of these types that I'm showing you, they were originally intended for people that didn't have enough money to buy a house, a big house, an attached lot, and or they were new to an area and they were just trying to rent a small apartment, and so these were different choices of how to do that. And the cottage court is really popular down here in Southern California. Here's one in Pasadena, beautiful example. It's bigger, obviously, but even though it looks grand, those units aren't that big. I think these are probably 600-700 square foot, maybe 800 square foot units at the most. 1 story around this garden with a couple of units in the back there in that 2-story building. And then there's this one. This is the triplex fourplex. So this is actually in Greenville, South Carolina, where we worked last year. I was driving with their client down this neighborhood of just beautiful single family houses, huge ones. And I said, hey, whoa, stop, let's look at this one. And it turned out to be a fourplex. I thought it was another big mansion like the rest of them, but it's actually 4 units. And you could see here the density range at the top. And then this is one that really struck me. I was in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, giving a talk on missing middle housing last year, and similarly driving around with the staff. And I said, wow, look at this big single family house. If you could redesign it. And they said, no, that's actually a 5-plex. So this is what in missing middle talk we call the multiplex, or a mansion is another name for it. But that is not a house. That's a 5-unit multiplex. And then at the other end of the spectrum, here's a multiplex in the Bay Area, just to show you this. We'll talk about it more, but this idea of density. Okay, so this one has 5 units, right? This one has 6 units, whole different architecture, granted, and everything else, and a smaller footprint. But look at the density number, 82 to the acre. And on the bottom right there, you can see I've provided some other sizes of lots that could make this building work with the size of the building that you're looking at on the screen, and what the density would be if you did that. And then a townhouse, there are 2 varieties of townhouses. There's what we call the large, where the buildings are 2 to 3 stories tall. There are usually more than 4 in a run, or left to right, arranged side by side. And so this is the large. And then here's the small, where it's no more than 2 stories, and it's usually 3 to 4 in a run, or side by side. So you can see here left to right, if you look closely, there are 4 doors there, but the whole building, see how it's detached from the next one? If you look quickly down the street and say, oh, that's one building, it's one house, and then you look closer, you say the different addresses. So the idea here is that this has certain places in a community where it would make sense, and this has certain places where it would make sense. And then at the top end of the spectrum of the missing middle types is the courtyard, where there's always a courtyard around which the units are facing. And sometimes the courtyard is deeper and larger, and sometimes it's, like this, just very modest in size. And you can see the difference in the lot sizes there on the bottom right. When you look at this presentation later, you can look at all those different lot sizes. This is the lot sizes we're showing reflect 2 things. One, the lot size that is on the screen, and the lot size, another lot size that will work for this building type. And then in some cases, you'll see here, let me go to one. I've tried to put, let's see here. Yeah, so for the duplex, I know that this will fit on the 50 by 100 lots that you all have. I looked at some areas. recently with Karen. And there are a lot of 50 by 100-foot lots. And so these types of work there. These other types, you can arrange properties to result in that much land. But sometimes the depths that you have of the 100 feet are a little limiting. So this one could work, well, if you put two lots together. And then lastly, the carriage house is the other missing middle type here. And it's basically the unit attached to the side or the top of a garage in the back, or along the side of a unit with a house. And the density here, basically take whatever the density is of the lot and double it by half because you have a second unit. But there are a lot of different ways to do ADUs, accessory dwelling units, but this particular way is called a carriage house. And so here's a quick summary of a quick look at your multifamily density of 15 units per acre maximum right now, and your town center density of 25 units per acre max, and a quick summary of what the types that I showed you, which of them are allowed and which of them might be allowed or not allowed based on those densities. And you can see that the multifamily density of 15 units the acre doesn't really allow a lot of them. It allows some of them. The townhouse density works for more of them, but but there are limitations as well as there. But anyway, that is working better, the town center density. Okay, so where do you find these types? These are some of the best examples I've seen across the country. This is Louisville, Kentucky, but it's very typical of what we see across the country. We find these in neighborhoods. Again, we aren't taking credit for inventing missing middle. We're just simply trying to say, hey, this is something that was working for communities as a way to vary their housing choices and housing types in neighborhoods of all kinds across the country. It was just happening. And then after World War II and the focus on single family housing, it went away. And so here is a great example in Louisville, Kentucky of on the right hand side of the screen, you'll see there, those are single family mansions with 4plexes and 8plexes right next to them in the same form as the mansions. And then just a couple examples here from different cities. This is Pasadena. That's a 4plex on the left. The cottage court top right, and a 4plex on the bottom right. Coeur d'Alene, there's that mansion that I showed earlier, that 5-unit mansion, townhouses on the top right, and a 4plex here on the bottom. And I want to really emphasize, this is not about architecture. It's about building size and how these buildings relate to the street and how they set a pattern of what looks like house scale buildings, just happen to have more than one unit in them. And here's in Greenville, South Carolina. And then here are a couple examples from the Tahoe area. So Karen made me aware of this 12-unit building here on the left. So we would call that a multiplex large, a larger version of the mansion. It's right at that top end of the spectrum. Then we found a 4plex and a duplex here. So where do you find it? That we found that there are 4 general patterns of how these building types either already exist in communities or communities work to make it happen. And so one way is just to allow them in existing neighborhoods through the zoning rules. And you can see that the buildings that are gray and white, those are houses that are already existing, and the yellow buildings with the brown roofs, those are the new missing middle types being inserted into that neighborhood over time by their owners. The second strategy is to say, hey, let's leave all the houses on the neighborhood alone and let them have accessory dwelling units. You can see them in the back of those lots. But then where the arrows are pointing, let's allow that on what we call the end grain of a single family block. let's allow those lots to change because it might be on a busier end of the block. Maybe there's a busier street going by there, and maybe that's where we can put missing middle types and leave the neighborhoods alone. Or maybe there's already the need for some higher intensity multifamily along that corridor on the right side of the screen. And as a transition to the houses, let's allow the first lot or the second lot away from the corridor. You see that alley there. Let me see if I can point there on the screen right here. Um, these two lots, some distance, maybe one lot or two lot. Let's let those get missing middle types and leave the rest of the neighborhood alone. Or a similar strategy of maybe there's a neighborhood main street here and on the busy street and going down into the neighborhood, you can transition from the main street to the neighborhood with these missing middle types. What we found here actually across the country is that this is a very real situation. You've got these buildings here on the main street, and then right here you have a house, and all of a sudden this house, because it's so close to this main street, often gets the pressure to redevelop, but the zoning doesn't let it happen. And so we found that this is a good strategy to consider, that either that first lot or that second lot is allowed to become a missing middle type. And that way it doesn't come into a commercial building and extend the commercial into the neighborhood. So what are the important characteristics here that need to be considered? Again, we really make the point that this is not another way to do medium density housing, because that's a whole other thing. So you remember I said that missing middle is house scale buildings with multiple units in walkable neighborhoods. Walkable neighborhoods meaning walkable places. So it might be a main street area, a small main street area. It might be a moderate intensity neighborhood, a higher intensity neighborhood, as long as it's walkable. So what makes walkable? So you see this map. This is a map we did in our work in South Carolina that shows all the centers in this community, and the blue dashed line around each of them is about a 5 to 8 minute walk. And so what we worked with the community there is we said, hey, all the lots that are within about a 5 to 8 minute walk, it's reasonable that those lots are within walking distance of these centers. And if you start thinking of centers as an amenity, and you have the biggest amenity already, the lake, the mountains, and the nature, but in terms of neighborhood amenities, if you start thinking of all these centers as amenities of different kinds, and you look at the lots that within about a 5 to 8 or 10 minute walk of that, then that right away tells you the type of the areas where you can start to really consider allowing missing middle housing. And that's different from parking missing middle housing, let's say way out here in this area where there isn't any center to walk to, and you're just going to be making people drive further to go get services or go get shopping or whatever they're doing. So this is how we promote missing middle housing, that it's part and parcel of a walkable place. Secondly, as I said, these buildings are all house scale. If you take the biggest house that you would like in your town, if you haven't defined that, then that's a way to start here. And take from the smallest cottage that you saw me show earlier and go to the largest house that you would consider in your town to be house scale. That is a range of house scale in your town. And that's going to tell you a lot about the footprint, which most zoning codes don't consider. They consider bulk, they consider height, they consider all these other things, but they don't consider, well, how wide can that footprint be? And so that's how you get there. But it has to look like a house, not just architecturally, but in its footprint and size. And then the other important characteristic of missing middle is that it's simple construction. It's stick wood frame construction. Because it's 2 stories. Sometimes, like you see on the left side of the screen here, this is a project we're doing in Nebraska for a multifamily developer, a former multifamily developer who said, I don't want to do multifamily anymore, I want to do missing middle. And so this developer is building 2 stories, or in this case, this is what we call a 2.5 story house, because the attic is occupied. So there's a partial third floor up in that attic, but from the street it looks like a 2 story house with a pitched roof. And then the other big characteristic of Missing Middle is that the units are uh, hovering around 1,000 square foot average. Um, and sometimes, there are 400 square foot units in there. There's 600, there are 800, maybe there's a 12, maybe there's a 1,400. Rarely do you find units that are in 2,000 or bigger. You certainly can do that, but the idea of this approach is to make their demand on parking, make their demand on area, all of those things less by making the square footages smaller, and also making them more affordable by doing that. Because let's talk about this for a second. The 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 problem with the density approach to regulation that we found is that if you tell a developer this is the maximum number of units that you can get because of the density, they're going to build the largest units that they can, because they have a limited number, and so if they have a limited number, wouldn't you get bigger so you could sell them for more? This approach says no. Let's see how many you can fit into that building based on the building footprint and based on other characteristics. And if you could design them right, why shouldn't you get more? The other characteristic along with this is that parking is less, and parking is critical. It's super local. Nobody wants to take anybody's advice from anywhere else. I hate to tell you, one of the big Achilles, not Achilles heel, but a real critical point in all these considerations is certainly parking. And this is an analysis that colleagues of ours did while we were working on a project in Austin, Texas a few years ago. And they did this analysis about the impact of adding parking to projects. And basically, you can see at the bottom, going from 1 space to 2 per unit actually adds about 30% to the income required to keep that affordable. And we could talk about this for 2 hours by itself, but I'll just suffice it to say that parking is super local. Parking needs to be certainly worked out, but the second that you start adding, like if you apply a very suburban approach to this idea of missing middle housing, you're going to make the projects bigger than they need to be, and the lots are going to need to be bigger than they need to be, and the neighbors are going to say it's too big and all these other things, and starts to become something else. And that's why we are so we advocate so strongly that this idea be connected to walkable places that don't have the same parking demands as a suburban neighborhood does. And then the barriers. So, people say, well, this sounds interesting, but what about this and what about that? And so that's what we found. There are a lot of barriers. Some of them are obvious and some are not. In the work that we did in Greenville, South Carolina, we did some work in Idaho Falls last year as well. And right now we're working in a couple other communities across the country doing what we call a missing middle scan. And what this showed in those communities is that their zoning standards, you'll see on the left there, it says 0 units in yellow. Well, this zone technically allows 20 units to the acre, and it's a multifamily zone. But when we applied the site setback standards to a 60-foot wide infill lot, it rendered the lot useless. And we pointed this out to the agency, and they said, wow, no wonder we don't get anybody coming in to try to do multifamily on infill lots. So it was either an attempt to prevent multifamily, or it was more likely the latter of applying a 25-foot wide setback to a big property of a couple acres. Makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't make any sense on an infill lot. So you can see on the right-hand side, we said, okay, well, regardless of the current rules, what would fit there? Let's just say that you could rewrite the rules in 2 seconds. What would fit there nicely? And so we showed how a multiplex one of those mansions with 5 units in it would fit and still be within the 20 units the acre um, maximum allowed density. And so let's talk about density for a couple minutes here. The building on the left has 49 units in it and is a couple hundred feet long, about 100, well, a little under a couple hundred. It's like 175 feet long. The building on the right has 5 units, and it's one of those mansion fiveplexes. It's about 37 feet long, 38 feet long, something like that. But numerically, look at the bottom of the screen. They're almost the exact same density. The building on the left is 30, and the building on the right is 29. But they couldn't be more different. And yet, communities have long drawn out battles and spend lots of time and resources trying to arrive at the right number. And we have found that there is no right number. And so let me continue, and I'll give you a recommendation, but this is just an observation that we've seen over and over again. So let's take this fourplex that I showed earlier. Most of the time, I mean, I would say I've never met anybody that I've shown this building to that says, wow, I can't stand that building. It's a beautiful fourplex by the Green and Green brothers, the architects that worked in Pasadena quite a lot. And so this lot is 60 by 170. It has 4 units on it, and it mathematically comes out to 17 to the acre. When the Green and Green brothers designed this, the density wasn't limited. This is what they designed it for. So we're just calculating the density now after the fact. But let's take that same building and let's add 5 feet. You see in this middle scenario, let's add 5 feet to the lot width and make it 65 feet wide. What does that do? It drops the density by 1 unit per acre to 16. Let's subtract 5 feet, and now there's less lot width, and now it's 55 feet wide, and the number jumps to 19. So this building can go from 16 to 19 to the acre, and yet it doesn't change. And 5 feet is almost imperceivable. It's a little wider than this hedge here that we're talking about, and yet the density goes up and down. And there's all kinds of different examples you can look at about that. And so the other big character or a metric that communities use is floor area ratio. So let me explain this very quickly, briefly. Floor area ratio is another tool like density that was derived early on in zoning practice, where whoever is making the rules says, let's say it's 1.0 floor area ratio is allowed. That means for the entire lot area, you get the same amount of square footage coverage. So if you have a 10,000 square foot lot, you get 10,000 square feet of coverage, and then minus setbacks, of course. So that's how it's intended to be used, and then it's a simple calculation. So somebody says, oh, I have 10,000 square feet. I can stack it up into 3 stories, or I can stack it up into 4 stories. I can stack it in 1 story. You know, there's all kinds of different ways to do it. So floor area ratio is the amount of building relative to the amount of lot. So on the left here, you see the stacked duplex in that neighborhood I showed earlier, and its floor area ratio is 0.67. And it has front setbacks, side setbacks, and rear setbacks. But look at this building on the right. A 24-unit, 3-story apartment building is completely different than the 2-story duplex. And yet its floor area ratio is lower, 0.63. So if we assume that lower is better, you would be saying that the 3-story building on the right is a better fit than the 2-story building on the left for a neighborhood. And depending on the neighborhood, that might work. But most neighborhoods, the building on the right is not going to be a good fit. That's a big apartment building that is a different category of everything that we've been talking about. So our point here is simply to say that density and floor area ratio are very prevalent tools that communities use. And we're just saying that they're very limited in what they can do and need to be taken into context of how much they should really be driving discussion and driving regulation, because the predictability that they offer is very low. And a couple last examples here. So a couple of mixed use buildings in town centers in Marin County where we're currently working on objective standards. The building on the left is totally loved. People totally identify with it. It's the Blue Rock Hotel, probably 100 years old at least, 25 units. And look at the density, 121 to the acre. Uh, the one on the right is in San Anselmo, and it has 2 units in it. It has 22. So the building on the left would not be allowed anywhere in your by your zoning standards, but the building on the right would. I think it's also interesting though that if somebody said, you know what, today those 2 units aren't enough to make that work with the cost of construction and everything else, so I want to put a third unit in there. The calculation for that means that the density would jump to 30, I think 32 I calculated. So it wouldn't be allowed by your current 25 to, maximum in your town center standards. And for the one on the left to be allowed in your current density of 25 to the acre in town centers, it would have to come down to 5 units. And so that building, I don't know that somebody would build a 5 unit building with 3 stories. It would probably be a 2-story building. So again, there's a relationship between the form and the intensity of buildings, and that really needs to be there. And so what we found, our experience is that the floor area ratio and the density tools, although very interesting and helpful, are often very limiting in ways that don't really benefit the outcomes. And then other things that we ask you to consider is to stop using, in terms of barriers, to stop using multifamily as a term, especially for missing middle housing, because as you're going to see, it's really not multifamily as we know it. And also, as soon as you say that, for opponents and for a lot of people that are concerned about neighborhood character and scale and compatibility, whether you intend it or not, for a lot of people, this is what they think you're talking about. So we talk about housing choices. And then it's important to understand, here is an aerial of St. Helena in the Napa area. It's important to understand when you're writing rules and redoing zoning standards that these all the buildings that we're talking about, and every building that you can think of falls into basically 2 categories. It's either block scale, like the buildings on the left, which are individually as large as a block, or attached together what forms most or all of a block. So they look like they're covering an entire block or most of it, individually or collectively. And then buildings on the right in the purple, those are what we're talking about with missing middle. Those are house scale. And so they're detached, they have setbacks, they have medium to small footprints. They can be a couple different stories, maybe 1, maybe 3, but they're house scale. And whether it's a small church or it's a big house with 6 units in it, that's a different scale and different footprint than the buildings on the left. So knowing this is super helpful when you write rules. And that all boils down to that everything we've been talking about really points to the fact that missing middle is not single family and it's not multifamily as we know it. And that's why it takes special attention to understand what missing middle is and is not, so that you can actually write rules that don't mess up the multifamily world for the people that are doing that work, and don't confuse the single family world with all that. It really merits its own consideration and own standards. So who's building this? We're doing a project right now in Nebraska, like I mentioned, and these are the building types that developer has chosen to build. It's super interesting that developer said to us, I've been doing buildings with corridors and lobbies and all these other things, and I don't want to do that anymore. I want to do buildings that are walk up and don't have elevators and don't have any corridors. And the reason he didn't want to do corridors is that he couldn't really lease that. It's what it's what he called non leasable area. And so he wanted to maximize the amount of area that he actually could lease, and very smart. And so these missing middle types, since they're all walk-up, they do that. And then this is a project in South Jordan, Utah. It's a version of the townhouse, but it's a cousin of it, really. So we designed this project, um, and it's going really well. It's one of their best performing housing choices in that entire community. You can see here the different housing choices on this table, and on the left and the bottom, the developer told us that this particular Muse townhome was actually getting the highest return in terms of, or highest sale price per square foot for the attached housing. So what can you, this is the last section here, what can you do to enable missing middle housing? And I don't want to read all these to you. There are 11 of these, what I've been told, hacks. I grew up with the term hack meaning not very good. Like that person's a hack, that means they're not very good at that. But I was told by planners that zoning hack meant like tips. So this list is intended as a list of tips that we've found over and over are really places to start. So I'll just take 10 seconds here and you can read through them or glance at them. And then they're certainly here on the recording. Okay, um, and certainly we have time for questions afterwards, so I'm certainly welcome to take questions on any of this. And a couple of examples of getting started. So in South Bend, Indiana, about 2 years ago, we worked there on something like this, and the community there as a first step said, well, just give us some direction on how to analyze our existing lots and what they can do, what they can actually accommodate on these different types. And so we gave them some directions, some things to look for, and worked with them, and they did this analysis. And so you can see the different types of lots, sizes that they looked at, and they coordinated them with the different missing middle types that would fit on those lots. And they were able to understand how their zoning could be tweaked or needed to be replaced, or just changes. And then of course there's this other technique that we've done for communities where we do a scan or a deep dive, and we actually show very clearly what your zoning is doing and what it needs to do to actually use those lots for missing middle housing. And then lastly, I think one of the most effective techniques that we found is pilot projects. Oftentimes after a talk like this, communities are interested, and developers are interested, and maybe even the neighbors are interested, but they're hesitant to start making changes. And so one of the ways that we found that really works for those kinds of situations is for a developer who's interested and a community and the neighbors to say, hey, there's that vacant parcel down there, or there's that parcel that project's being proposed on, but what if we did a missing middle project and we just found a way, like the plan development permit, for example, to arrive at a missing middle project on that property without changing the rules yet. And whatever we find that works on that property is going to inform how we're going to change the rules later. And so we found that across the country to be working very nicely. So that's my talk, and I'm ready for questions, and thank you for your patience and listening.
Thank you, Tony. That was great. If you have questions for Tony, please raise your hand if you are a local government and housing committee member, and we'll call on you. And if you are an attendee, you can feel free to put your question in the Q&A box at the bottom bar on your Zoom screen. And with that, I have a couple questions that I would like to kick off. You did mention parking, Tony, but in Tahoe, I think we have sort of a unique situation because of the snow in the winter. So there's not a whole lot of on-street parking during the winter. So wondering if a lot of these photos that you showed in your presentation, it looked like there wasn't parking, or maybe it was just sort of hidden in the back. So wondering if you can kind of speak to how you deal, or how you've seen other communities deal with the issue of parking, and if you have any recommendations for us.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned to you, everything comes down to parking. It just does. Um, so what we found, well, first of all, in snow country, we found sometimes communities can work with their public works departments to allow parking on one side, but that can be problematic. So that set aside, what we found is that parking for these types is in the 1 to 1.25 um, um, parking spaces per unit range, sometimes up to 1.5. But once you get past that, as I was mentioning, you start to get a parking lot that is bigger than the lot you're working with. And it can't work. So that's why it has to really stay around one space per unit, or I would say up to 1.5 at the most, just because of size alone. Um, you know, a lot of zoning codes, because of their requirements, have actually caused across the country, have caused this project to eat its neighbor, if you will, to tear down the neighbor to get more open space or produce more parking, and that isn't necessarily a good pattern either. So the balance we found is between 1 and 1.5 spaces per unit maximum. And yeah, they were in the back and down the side, to answer your question on location.
Great, thank you. It looks like Jim Lawrence has his hand raised, so I will unmute you, Jim.
Hey, good morning. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, Tony. That was a great presentation. Really appreciated it. It actually had me reflecting back to my college days in Eugene, Oregon, where it seemed like everybody I knew rented a duplex because every corner lot was a duplex in Eugene. And then I moved to Northern Nevada, and I was like, where's all the duplexes? I thought it was great, extremely important topic. You know, one of the struggles we have at Tahoe is that, you know, there is development caps for environmental reasons that are embedded in the regional plan. And for the most part, it's sort of seen that Tahoe is already developed, and redevelopment is really the key to the future, as opposed to having an abundance of vacant lots to start building these projects. And we're really talking about redevelopment. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts or experience with that, you know, working with different communities, you know, what are some of the better tools in more of a redevelopment situation as opposed to a vacant land situation, or is there a difference? Maybe it doesn't matter one way or the other.
No. Actually, you know, my presentation today and our office's approach to this is primarily redevelopment, or what we call infill. When I said infill, I was talking about redevelopment. Yeah, you know, we do work on some greenfield projects, but that is a rare exception. What we advocate for is that instead of communities adding on uh, to themselves, either because they can or they don't want to for environmental reasons or traffic reasons, that they reconsider how they're using certain areas. And that's why that map about the walkable places is so important. Once you start looking at your area like that, it's going to start to really help you hone in on which areas geographically make sense to consider. I'd want to be careful to not imply to everyone here that that map is all of a sudden becomes your missing middle map, and you go rezone those properties. You could do that, but that's not what we're saying. We're saying that's where you start looking. And Dan likes to use a term, Dan Perolic in our office likes to use the term missing middle ready. So if you go back to that slide, you'll see that term. And I think that's an approach that we found helpful, is that you're not talking, you know, some communities or states like Oregon and Minneapolis, the city of Minneapolis, they're looking at, well, let's just get away from single family housing and all that. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that this is a strategy that used to be a part of neighborhoods. And so go look at the areas that could accommodate this type of development where development already exists. So maybe there's a gas station or something, or there's a duplex that could become a sixplex. You know, that kind of consideration. Yeah, I don't mean to go into single family neighborhoods and change them.
Thanks, Troy. That's helpful. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thanks, Jim. Another question about affordable housing subsidies. Curious, Tony, about your experience with these types of developments. Are they usually market rate, or have you seen affordable housing tax credits go towards these types of developments, or is it generally that higher level?
Yeah, so great question. We usually have a slide in here about, and you'll see it in Dan's book, The Missing Middle Housing Book. There's a diagram they put together that shows subsidies on the left and increasing supply on the right. In the middle is the missing middle diagram, and that's our position, is that uh, missing middle can use subsidies, but it tends to not. The people that we see building it and developing it, it turns into market rate very quickly, because people say, wow, I didn't have that choice, and that's a nice little fourplex to live in. I want to go live in that. I want to go buy or rent that unit. And so um, it, it's it's a it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, you have the housing choices being made available. On the other hand, they become market rate very quickly because of their very presence and absence in the current market. So our experience has been that the subsidies are not very prevalent in this approach, but it doesn't mean that you couldn't use them, of course.
Right. And then another question about ADA requirements. And I think this is probably more related to those types of developments that are stacked instead of right next to each other. Or have you seen any limitations with having to provide for ADA requirements, or you could speak to that as well?
Yeah, so the ground floors of multi-unit buildings are usually the ADA units. And then because it doesn't, the law doesn't make you make every unit accessible. But once you have an elevator, that changes. So these buildings are non-elevator buildings. And so what we found is making the ground floor units accessible, zero grade entry, that kind of thing, then that works. The second you make it an elevator building, everything changes. So I just want to differentiate this from multifamily apartments that way.
All right, looking through the Q&A box. Currently in Tahoe, we already have lots of mega mansions that have already been built. Some of them will no longer be able to be used as VHRs soon, vacation home rentals, which was their original purpose. Have you had success getting people to convert these huge homes into 2 to 4 units? And if you have any experience with this, it'd be great to hear.
Yeah, I think that we haven't seen a lot of that. It depends on the area. Like you all are in an area where that's a real big issue. So I would say that those kinds of buildings that are already set up as individual units are perfect for conversion, because you're not having to put it in a new kitchen, a new restroom. They're already built that way. And that's another thing to not get lost here, is if you look at the missing middle buildings that we're advocating and we're building, uh, they're the same as the ones in the 40s and the 20s, in the sense that uh, they always were individual units. They always had their individual restroom, maybe a kitchenette, maybe a bigger kitchen, but they were never just, I want to differentiate this from the fraternity house syndrome, where, it's as many people as you can fit. That's not what we're talking about. The vacation home rental actually is it's easy to convert because they're individual units already designed that way. But the other issue with a vacation home rental is whether it really is one of these things, or is it just some giant building that happens to have individual units in it. So uh, what I hear you saying is it sounds like it is, but I don't know that without looking at it.
And Alexis, I want to give you the opportunity. I see that you have your camera on and wasn't sure if you had a question. Nope. Okay. Let's see. We did get a question in the beginning about TRPA's density focus and how that relates to our growth management system through the development rights that we have available. And I think that this is sort of an important distinction to make, that TRPA's development rate system is, you know, limits the amount of growth that can happen, but the density really limits where that growth can take place. So when we talk about increasing density, we're really looking at the areas that are already zoned for multifamily or within our town centers. So it wouldn't be expanding the number of units that are still available in our growth management system. It would just be concentrating those in an area where we want them.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. And I think that another thing to consider there is that um, very few communities have the problem. Well, let me put it positively. Very few communities actually um, achieve the amount of allowed density on the properties the way that the general plan says that they're allowed. Let's say a community says 12 units to the acre maximum. Most communities have the problem. Somebody said, well, that's great, you allow me 12, but I'm building at 8 because what I build, my production of what I build and sell is at 9. All of a sudden, you multiply that lack of 3 units per acre achievement over all the other properties, and communities are finding themselves short of housing because of that. So uh, that's one thing. The other thing is to look at where you're allowing certain densities and ask yourself the question, uh, is that going to be achieved there? And if it isn't, should we allow some to be achieved somewhere else? And either take the limit off, or because the other thing is you can do it by density units per acre, but you can also do it by not regulating density the same way and just regulating number of units. It's more work, but it's more accurate.
All right, it looks like Shelly has a question. Shelly, you are unmuted.
Thank you. Nice presentation, Tony. Thank you. I have a couple of questions. You know, we're dealing with kind of a new and unusual dynamic, and I'm just wondering how the pandemic has affected housing choices when people are forced oftentimes to quarantine for long periods of time. I mean, I can only imagine how difficult it is for people living in small apartments to confine themselves to an apartment for months on end. And I'm wondering if that's going to change the, you know, or increase the desirability of larger units and maybe even result in a kind of a rebounding of the market for single family homes.
Yeah, it's certainly a real concern right now. I think that what we're seeing, talking to developers across the country and different communities, is that while that's a very real concern, it's seen by most people as probably a temporary concern and not necessarily something that's going to last um, into the following years that would permanently affect um, multifamily. However, there probably is a segment of the population that would be permanently affected, and they're thinking about needing bigger units or a single family house. That you know is certainly out there, but our experience is that is a fraction of the population. So again, we're
okay. Next question: on a percentage basis, how many of these new missing middle housing types are for sale and how many are for rent? Because I think people are of the opinion that if you have a vested interest in a unit, whether it be a townhome unit, you know, a condominiumized apartment unit, that you're more likely to take better care of it. You know, it's an investment you've made, you know, for the foreseeable future. So it is, have you found that there is less resistance from, let's say, adjacent single family neighborhoods if these units, which are smaller and oftentimes more, on smaller lots and more dense, that there's less resistance if they're actually owned by the occupants as opposed to rented by the occupants?
Yeah, I think that's generally true. That people, although I can go down my street here and show you people that own their house that aren't taking care of it the way the neighbors think they should be taking care of it. So it's ownership is not a universal, doesn't universally result in higher or better maintenance, but generally that expectation is true, that people say, oh, it's going to be for ownership. Okay, my resistance is different now. They might still resist it. It just would be different. But yeah, I think that's the case.
And also, have you found that there's less resistance to the idea of using accessory dwelling units as rentals than coming into a single-family neighborhood that's traditionally been used for that purpose and changing the zoning to accommodate a new type of housing form?
It depends on the neighborhood. I think it totally depends. I can give you examples at both ends of that spectrum. If you're talking about the peninsula in the Bay Area, St. Carlos and Mountain View and those kinds of places, San Mateo, they're super worried about a house, let alone an ADU. But in other areas where reinvestment is being really sought after, it's a different conversation. It's actually, people are excited to be coming in and seeing, wow, there's that fourplex going down the street, or that duplex coming in. It's better than what we had, or so it just depends on the perspective I can't give you a universal answer, but there are answers across that spectrum, and it just depends on where you are.
Okay, well, no, I appreciate that. And one last question. We've received, as members of the committee, emails from folks who think that the solution to workforce housing in the Tahoe Basin is to basically put a damper on short-term rentals. And I guess this is a comment for TRPD staff and a question for you. I'm not sure of the total number of STRs in the Tahoe Basin. How many are actually rented full-time as opposed to being rented part-time and then part-time used by the actual owners of those houses? And that would be a useful statistic to have, because the assertion that somehow we're going to solve workforce housing by eliminating STRs, I think is kind of a fallacious argument. But what has been your experience in other communities? And I'm sure that communities around the country, around the world, are having similar issues with short-term rentals and their impacts on neighborhoods and communities. But have you found that STRs are a deterrent to the development of missing middle housing?
No, they're two different conversations. They're two different topics. Short-term rentals are, they speak to the desirability of your place. They, hey, I can own a unit in Tahoe and not live there, and feel like I'm part of the community, and feel like a local, and not have to rent a hotel for a bunch of money, and have a local connection, as opposed to workforce housing and/or missing middle housing, which is, I want to live there, and I don't want to rent there all the time. And I may rent my missing middle unit, but I'm not a short-term tenant. So they're two different conversations, but they're not mutually exclusive.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for your questions.
Thank you, Shelley. Another question about parcel size. There tends to be smaller parcels in Tahoe, and parcel consolidation is not very common to create, those larger courtyard projects that you showed in your presentation. Do you have a sense of what percentage of a parcel would need to be developed in terms of land coverage in order to accommodate these housing types?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, great question. So just taking, again, I'm not an expert in Tahoe, but I looked at the South Tahoe area that I showed on the map very early in the presentation, and those lots were all 50 by 100. And so the duplex, both varieties of the duplex would work on those. The fourplex could work with some creativity, but in order to get more than the fourplex on the 50 by 100 foot lot, you'd have to combine another lot to get a little wider lot. And so I'm not here advocating for that. Actually, the opposite is what we do. What we advocate for is that you work with the existing lot patterns you have, because too many zoning codes um, enable, well, say they enable something, but what you really have to do is go buy more property to do that. And that just makes you tear down your neighbor, and it makes for more speculation. It says, oh, Alyssa, you own that house to the right of me. Guess what? You know, I have to buy that property to make my project work. And everybody knows that, and it actually freezes things. So you want to be very careful to not make your standards require parcel assembly. So my answer to the South Tahoe area is that only pick the types that work on lots that are 50 by 100, and um, allow projects to be wider than that, but make the standards work for the lots that are there. And in terms of lot coverage, sorry, that was the second part. Lot coverage, what we found is that the lot coverage in most zoning codes is more than you need for these types. That's again back to the house scale. House scale is like 36, 38, 40 feet wide by 60 feet deep, depending on lot width. Sometimes it's 50 to 60 feet wide by 60 feet deep. They're usually not bigger than that, often 40 by 40. And what we find is that the lot coverage in most zoning codes lets those buildings cover more of the lot. So what happens is there might not be that many units on it, but the neighbor says, man, that building's huge, and it's only 2 stories. So back to footprint. So the footprint of missing middle types is always less, well, typically less than what city zoning codes allow in lot coverage.
Thank you. One more question about parking. There's quite a few examples in the Bay Area of developments where they use the first floor as indoor parking. I'd imagine that would be quite expensive, but can you speak to that at all? Is that a good thing to do, a bad thing to do?
Yeah, so the thing with parking is, if you notice the pictures that I showed, what was being shown was the building and the ground floor and the sidewalk. In some cases, there's no sidewalk, but the front yard. And that ground floor relationship between the unit and you walking by is a lot of times a big deterrent for people. If it's negative, it's like, oh, it's just a parking lot, ground floor is nothing. It's like that multifamily building I showed as a negative example. That's what people start thinking of that area. And they say, oh, is that what you're making? No, thanks. We're not going to do that. But the second you start to be more creative with parking and put it down the side or in the back, and I know that you have snow, so it's harder and the driveways are expensive. But the main thing is you don't want it glued onto the front if you can help it. You want to put it down the side, maybe behind the first 30 feet of the building. If you're going to put it inside the building and on the ground floor, put it behind the first 30 feet, because 30 feet is a good depth of a unit. And from the street, you'd say, oh, there's a unit. I don't see the parking. But you go behind it, and the parking is there behind it. And now you can put units on top of that or behind it.
Great, thank you. I think this is actually a really great question. When someone builds a fourplex or another type of missing middle housing, does the contractor or developer typically own the building and rent it out and rent each unit out? Or do you oftentimes see that they will just sell the whole building?
Yeah, great question. In Nebraska, that project is, I think it's 600 units on, I want to say 40 acres in a new neighborhood. It's called Prairie Queen in Papillon, Nebraska. And that developer chose to own them all and to rent them all. You know, he's a multifamily developer, although he says that's not what he does anymore. He's still an apartment builder. And so he owns the whole thing. We've seen all kinds of things. We've seen people build a pocket neighborhood and sell the houses individually, fee simple, or a condo. We've seen people condo, you know, a sixplex, a fourplex, but one of the barriers is above 4 units. Then that's when usually requirements come in terms of commercial loans, the parcel map, condo map, and then you know it just requires a lot more sophistication or patience on the part of the builder of whether to own or rent. But so there's all those kinds of considerations, which is why often the fourplex and the duplex are what communities go after, because it's just so much easier for everyone. You're not gonna. That's the other thing is those of you that you know are policymakers or maybe investment encouragers, and you talk to developers. The big developers probably won't go for this because they have their models and they have their certain amounts that they need to build and the way they manage those properties. And maybe in 20 years that'll change, but right now we find that the majority of developers looking at this are smaller developers that might have previously been building houses, and they're used to building houses. Now they're just building houses with a couple of units, you know. So and then the last part of your question, ownership or rental, we found out everything. We found some builders that say, I want to hold on to them, like the Nebraska one. Some that say, here's a duplex, I can sell it and move on. So it just depends.
Great, thank you. I think we are going to wrap it up. Tony, thank you so much. That was a very informative presentation and great questions.